Tonight we're stepping quietly into a world that feels almost imagined, where stone castles pierce foggy skies, the scent of damp earth clings to thatched rooftops, and the flicker of torchlight dances through winding village roads. It's the 1300s in the French countryside. You're not just visiting, you're living there. And tonight is supposed to be the happiest night of your life. Before we start, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've waited for this day. The village bells rang at noon. Wheat garlands were braided, and your bride looked radiant beneath her floral crown. Friends and neighbors gathered in song, clapping along as a fiddle played a slightly off-key wedding march. You've danced on packed dirt, toasted with weak ale, and laughed with teary parents. Life in your small world feels for once complete. But when night falls and the guests trickle home, something's off. You guide your bride, now your wife, into the modest hut you've built with your own hands. The hearth crackles. Straw mattresses are fluffed. Everything is in place for the start of your new life. Except you're not alone. Standing inside the shadows of your doorway is the local lord. Behind him, a few of his men. Their boots are still muddy. Their eyes don't blink. At first, you think maybe it's a courtesy, a blessing, some absurd noble ritual you hadn't heard of. But then he speaks not kindly, not ceremonially. He points to your wife and smiles. He's not here to celebrate. He's here to invoke his right. What right? Just Prime Noctis, the first night. A custom where lords had the power unquestioned to sleep with any peasant bride on her wedding night. Not symbolic, not metaphorical. Real. You freeze. Every part of your being screams to act. But you don't, because you can't. If you try to stop him, you die. Your bride dies. Maybe even your family disappears into the woods, never to return. There's no court to appeal to, no townsfolk uprising, no gallant hero with a long sword riding in from the mist. There's just you, and the Lord, and his right. And before you think this is just legend, just dark fantasy for bedtime drama stand, that this belief was pervasive enough to appear across European folktales, theater, paintings, and angry revolutionary songs centuries later. While historians debate whether it was ever lawfully codified, its power as myth, as rumor, as weapon was very real. It doesn't matter whether he claims her that night or not. What matters is that he can. That power hangs in the air of every thatched roof. It seeps into every marriage. It defines what it means to be poor in a world where power was flesh and blood, not just taxes and titles. And after he leaves, after she's returned, shaken, quiet, you're expected to carry on, to smile in the fields the next morning, to work the land he owns, to raise a child that might not even be yours, because this was feudal Europe, where the land had rules, but the powerful did not. Now let's pan out for a moment. Imagine the psychological cost, the emotional erosion of dignity. Over time, this wasn't just cruelty, it became a learned silence. You knew not to ask why. You knew not to protest. Generations raised under submission stopped recognizing it as injustice. It simply was. And before we write this off as a single grotesque custom, let's think deeper. What kind of society allows this to become rumor, or worse, tradition? What scaffolding of fear, religion, and lawlessness is needed for someone to walk into a family's home, claim their rights over another human being, and walk out unpunished? Well, friend, that scaffolding was vast. And it only gets darker from here. See, your Lord didn't just claim first nights. He claimed harvests, sons for war, daughters for service. Timber, fish, sheep, salt, even the rain that touched your land. If he wanted it, it was his. The church blessed him. The king ignored him. And your fellow villagers whispered his name like a spell they were afraid to finish. you begin to understand something crucial. In the Dark Ages, ownership wasn't about contracts or coins. It was about presence. The Lord was the law, the judge, and if he fancied himself godly enough, the moral compass of your village. And the church? It didn't challenge this. In many cases, it endorsed it. There's no equal under God here. There's no divine justice waiting in the clouds. There's just mud, silence, and power that walks on two legs and drinks wine from goblets while you bury your third child from hunger. That wedding night, so vivid in the beginning, now fades into shadow, not because it didn't matter, but because in the centuries that followed, so many weddings would carry the same dread, the same helplessness. It wasn't a singular horror. It was woven into the very fabric of life. But don't despair just yet. This tale, though grim, is long and layered. As we follow the thread deeper into this labyrinth of forgotten suffering, strange customs, and creeping resistance, we'll begin to see how the darkness wasn't just enforced, it was engineered. And if something is engineered, perhaps it can be unbuilt. But first, we need to understand how it was constructed. From its roots in collapsed empires, to the whispers of priests in stone holes, to the slow erasure of truth, one banned book at a time. We'll get there, slowly, gently, just like the way the night slips into your room without you noticing. The image of the Lord stepping through the doorway still lingers like smoke after a fire. And now, we pull back not away, but up, seeing the full weight of the world pressing down on that couple. That wasn't a fluke. That wasn't one wicked man abusing his station. That was the system, working exactly as intended. See, in the medieval world, power wasn't just visible in swords or armor. It lived in every grain of barley, every harvested apple, every newborn child, and every tree that grew from the soil. And all of it, the land, the animals, the rivers and bridges, belonged to one man, your Lord. He wasn't a temporary figure or someone up for election. He was the living symbol of control in a universe built like a pyramid. At the very bottom, you, then your neighbors, then the reeve, then the bailiff, then the noble family, and at the tippy top of your little world, a man who might never lift a hoe in his life, but who could lift his finger and have someone whipped or worse. Now, this isn't to say every lord was a cackling villain stroking a hawk in a tower. Some were generous, some were fair. But that's the thing about unchecked power. It doesn't need to be evil to do harm. It just needs to be absolute. You might live on a farm that's been in your family for generations, but it's not your land. Every harvest, a portion, sometimes a massive portion, goes to the Lord. Same with any livestock you raise. If you catch a fish in the nearby stream, you'd better hope it's not on one of his private days. If you gather firewood in the forest, that could be considered poaching. And poaching, back then, wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It could be your hand, or your life. Even the roads you walked on to sell your goods at market were considered owned by someone. And to use them? Tolls, sometimes literal gates with armed men. Sometimes just a scowling knight who'd block the way until he heard the jingle of coins. But perhaps the most chilling part? The system taught you to be grateful for it. Lords didn't just demand, oh no, they convinced. We protect you. They'd say, we build your bridges. We fend off raiders. Without us, you'd be nothing. And that last line? That's the one people started to believe. In a way, they weren't wrong. The world was harsh. Bandits roamed. Vikings weren't a distant memory. Diseases spread like gossip. Having a lord's banner flying over your village might be the only reason a rival army passed you by. But at what cost? Picture this. You're 10 years old. You've already seen more funerals than birthdays. You wake before the sun, 10 sheep in the frost, and by 12, your hands are calloused. If you're lucky, your parents teach you to pray, not read. Because reading? That's for the priests, for the nobility. for people who don't smell like goats every day. And still, at the end of a week's work, a tithe goes to the church and a tax to the Lord. Your wife spins wool all winter, only for half of it to be seized come spring. You dream of freedom, but you don't even have a word for it. Not really. The language of rights hasn't been invented yet. It's not that you don't demand better, you don't know you can. That's how deep the system goes. And the church, well, we'll get into them more soon. But let's just say they weren't exactly telling people to stand up for themselves. In fact, they often worked hand in hand with lords. After all, what's better than controlling land? Controlling land and souls. Let's take a small journey to the manor grounds. Imagine it with me. A large stone hall, surrounded by fences, filled with servants and horses. This isn't Versailles. It's more rustic than regal. But it's where decisions get made. Contracts are agreed upon here. Weddings are blessed or halted. Disputes are settled. And sometimes, punishments are handed out. Let's say you're caught stealing a loaf of bread. Not because you're a scoundrel. Just hungry. The miller's son saw you. Word gets to the reeve. You're dragged before the Lord. There's no jury. There's no lawyer. Just a man sitting in a large chair, holding a goblet. He listens. Then, without rising, he nods. That's it. Later that evening, your ear is nailed to the pillory post as an example. People walk by and shake their heads, not at the punishment, but at you. The message is clear. Don't cross the line. Don't question your place. But here's a twist. There's always a twist in bedtime stories, right? Not everyone bowed so easily. Some villagers fought back not with swords, but with stubbornness. They worked a little slower, hid portions of grain, whispered truths after dark. Some fled to forest communities, outlaw villages that sprang up in the wilderness, living without lords or priests. Risky, yes, but free. Others bent the system in quiet ways. Maybe a local priest learned to look the other way. Maybe a merchant passed secret books. Maybe an herbalist taught young girls how to heal before those girls would be hunted for it. And then there were the songs. Satirical songs mocking lords, sung under breath. Poems carved into stable walls. Tales passed to children that spoke of heroes who overthrew the cruel and made peace with the land. Resistance was there, quiet, flickering, like a candle in the wind. You see, even in the most stifling times, people imagine something else. That imagining, no matter how buried, is where change begins. But we're not there yet. Before the peasants could rise, they had to really see what was being done to them. And that awakening would take centuries. Because the next layer of control wasn't in the fields. It was in the soul. And it wore robes. The church is waiting. Behind its stained glass, with secrets deeper than any moat, ready to shape minds, urn books, and crown kings. Shall we knock? The cold dawn mist clings to your shoulders as you trudge toward the fields, barley sheaves in hand. The echo of the Lord's laughter from last night still lingers, a nagging itch beneath your ribs, reminding you that defiance is a dangerous notion. To refuse his demands is to gamble with your life literally. One misstep, one whispered complaint in a tavern quarter, and you or your kin could vanish without a trace. Just imagine the weight of that choice. You see your neighbor, old Marcus, who once dared to question why tithes doubled after every bad harvest. He didn't vanish, rumor says he fled to a forest encampment, only to be hunted down like a fox. They say he was found, knees knocked out from behind, dragged to the churchyard, and hanged as a traitor. His wife and children? Sold to a distant manor, scattered like scraps. So you learn early to cloak your true thoughts. You greet the reeve with a bow that's almost a curtsy. You laugh at the jester's jokes, even when they're about peasants being too stupid to know better. You nod along when the priest preaches that questioning authority is akin to questioning God, because in that world, The line between crown, cross, and club is dangerously thin. But what exactly happens when you do refuse? Let's pretend, purely for illustration, that you decide on a cold morning that enough is enough. You slam your wooden bucket onto the manure heap and declare you won't pay the extra harvest tax this season. You march to the manor gates, heart pounding, clutching a scrap of torn parchment where you've scrawled your grievances bold enough to challenge the Reeves ledger. Maybe you even step into the manor hall and wait, trembling, for the Lord's arrival. He appears, decades older than the portrait suggests, but eyes sharp as ravens. He reads the parchment with thin-lipped disdain, then he sets the paper ablaze with a flick of his finger. Smoke curls, stinging your eyes. Beside him, a priest quietly lifts his chalice and murmurs a blessing, ironically sanctifying the very act of your destruction. You're dragged away by armored guards and thrown into a cramped cell beneath the hall. Moss drips from the ceiling onto your collarbone as you shiver in the dark. Hours later, the priest arrives with a pamphlet ink-smudged and brittle with a sermon about obedience. You're forced to kneel on stones, reciting lines. Disobey, and you risk a branding iron on your cheek to mark you forever as a heretic. You try to stutter the words, but the cold and the fear make your voice crack. A guard kicks your leg. You finish hoarse and broken. The iron presses to your skin, squared and hot. Searing, you bite down on a scrap of cloth, teeth clenched. The world goes red, and you understand. This pain is the price of refusing. In the days that follow, you're paraded through the village, bleeding and branded. Mothers cover their children's eyes. Neighbors avert their gaze as you stumble past. Even the church bells stay silent, as if ashamed. The Lord's men mock you. Look upon the fool who tried to stand tall. The message is clear. Conformity is safety. Dissent is annihilation. And it's not just physical. The church wields a more insidious weapon, the threat of eternal damnation. They preach that sinners burn in hell's fire, an image bound in vivid sermons, complete with crackling flames and high-pitched screams. If you dare oppose the church's edicts, be it refusing confession, sheltering a hunted scholar, or secretly learning to read, you're branded a heretic. A witch, if you're a woman. And heretics and witches share the same fate. Trial by ordeal, a mockery of justice designed to terrify surviving villagers into unquestioning obedience. In a small chapel just beyond the village, the Inquisition writes its laws on fresh parchment. No longer oral decrees passed down by word of mouth, but written tomes, black-binding volumes infused with church authority. These reach far beyond the local Lord's Hall, granting priests the power to arrest, interrogate under torture, and deliver souls to the stake. Refuse to confess, and you're tied to a chair barebacked, ropes binding your arms until veins pop and bones ache. A priest stands over you with a candle, inching the flame closer to your skin until you swear to recant or beg for mercy. But mercy is rare. Peasants whisper names of those who've endured the ordeal. Old Marta burned at dawn for healing sores with herbal poultices. Her crime? Calling on the devil's herb for relief. There's Mathis, whose only sin was translating bits of the Bible into the local tongue. He was drowned at noon in the river declared innocent if the water swallowed him, but certainly drowned. No one was innocent in the Lord's eyes that day. Survival often means pretending devotion. You line up for Mass every Sunday, eyes downcast as the priest blesses the Lord and the Lord blesses the church. You give your coin, your grain, your voice to the hymns praising submission. Yet at home, you whisper to your children at night, be careful what you say. Be careful who listens. Still, beneath the fear and blood, resentment simmers like coals under ashes. You watch your children learn to whisper, too, how the world could be different. They hear tales of distant lands where kings are bound by councils, where scholars debate in open squares, where women heal freely without fear of burning. These stories slip past the guard's ears, because no guard watches over a child's mind. And so the price of refusing becomes layered. First, the branded burn or the broken arm. Second, the shame of public spectacle. Third, the knowing fear that your soul is twisted beyond repair. And finally, the cost to your children's dreams. Do they dare dream? Or does the brand on your cheek stand as their warning? In the dark of night, after the bells stop, and only the hoot of an owl accompanies your thoughts, you might find yourself inching toward a decision. Do you remain silent and safe? Or do you risk everything for a sliver of truth? Choices, consequences, death or hope. The line between them is razor thin in the dark ages. Yet even in that darkness, people found tiny cracks in the wall. A priest sympathetic to the poor might slip you a bulb of garlic to fight the plague. A shepherd might share a fragment of a Latin manuscript, letting you glimpse ideas of freedom. A traveling merchant could smuggle in a pamphlet about ancient Rome, where citizens once elected their own leaders. Resistance took many forms. Not grand uprisings, those were crushed within hours, but silent revolts, joining outlaw bands in the woods, sending secret letters to foreign scholars, teaching children to read by candlelight, reciting forbidden poems in the hush of night. That is the real price of refusing. It isn't just a life for a life. It's a risk that echoes through generations, planting seeds that one day might sprout into something unthinkable. A society where people hold rulers accountable, where knowledge flows freely, and where a man's right over another stops at the threshold of his home. But that day was still centuries away. Tonight, you stand here, heart pounding, caught between two worlds, one of fear and one of faint ember-bright hope. So you decide silently, trembling you will live to tell the tale. You tuck the memory of the branding iron deep inside, hide your dreams behind a mask of obedience, and carry on. Because survival, in those times, was itself an act of defiance. The dawn mist has lifted, but a different kind of fog settles over your mind as you trudge toward the little chapel perched on the village's edge. The church looms like a half-carved monolith of stone and stained glass, its shadow stretching across thatched roofs and tilled fields alike. You know why you're here, to learn to glimpse the holy words behind the altar rail. Yet as you step inside, you sense something strange, almost chilling in the hush. Rows of wooden benches creak under the weight of parishioners. Candles gutter in iron sconces, casting dancing silhouettes on the walls. The scent of incense is so heavy, it tickles your throat. You cough, then remember to cross yourself. No surprise here. Even breathing can feel like a confession. Education wasn't always like this. Before Rome fell in 476 AD, you might have found a public schoolhouse in a city under the imperial banner bare bones. Sure, but open to anyone who could prove a few coins. Magistrates taught reading, writing, arithmetic. Libraries in stone vaults stored scrolls on philosophy, engineering, medicine. But when the last Roman soldier marched home, or was too tired to care, the empire's network collapsed. Roads crumbled, aqueducts cracked, couriers vanished. In that vacuum, fear spread faster than any plague. People begged for stability. And who showed up? Not merchants with scrolls, but priests in robes. "We will guide you," they said, offering bread with one hand and a hymnal with the other. The church had moral authority. Sure, but soon it had every authority. Schools became chapels with chalkboards. Monasteries replaced academies. Latin was sacred, and only those who pledged obedience could learn it. You, a peasant born with dirt under your nails, were welcome to pray in the vernacular, but not to read the words. You shuffle forward to the priest, expecting a lesson. Instead, he hands you a single page of Latin text ink a little smudged, the edges yellowed. "Recite," he commands. You stare. The words look like a nest of crawling insects. In principio, crevit dies caelum et terram. You learned as a child that this meant God created heaven and earth, but memorized without understanding. You repeat it, voice low, every syllable a mystery. Behind you, a boy of 10 has his own paper. He recites faster, proud that father rewarded him with a pat on the head. You force a smile, hiding the sting of envy. That boy's father is the Reeves' cousin. Connections matter, even in God's house. After the lesson, the priest collects the pages and tucks them into his cassock. Perhaps next time, he says, if you've been obedient. He doesn't say what obedience looks like, but villagers nod, because that's what you do. Nod. Leave empty-handed, except for scraps of divine rules you cannot decipher. Outside, the sky glints with sunlight, and you realize your entire morning has vanished inside the church's walls. No wonder farmers call learning a tax. You paid with time and sweat, but gained only more silence. The church's hold extends beyond lessons. Look at the very language you speak. Latin is the language of God. Latin is the language of scholars. Latin is the language of law. While priests chant Mass in Latin, villagers murmur prayers in broken local tongues, a patchwork quilt of dialects with no standard. And words matter. If you can't read the law, you can't question it. Want to marry? The wedding vows are in Latin. Want to own land? The deed is in Latin. Want to settle a dispute? The verdict is in Latin. A scribbled signature, or rather, a thumbprint set beside Latin phrases, binds you forever. You simply cannot know what you pledge when you pledge it. The ink dries on parchments you cannot read, and the church vaults swell with documents you cannot touch. These aren't just sacred texts. They're ledgers, records of your tithes, records of your fines, records of your confessions. Every time you kneel before the altar, you lock another secret inside that vault. And here's the clever trick. If you ever demand those secrets back, if you ask for a translation, for a copy, or for an explanation, you become suspect. Why do you want to read the Bible? The priest asks, eyes narrowing. Better that you trust me to interpret God's will. But trust is a frail candle in a drafty hall. You want facts, not interpretations. You want the words themselves, not their shadows. As you wander past the graveyard gate later that day, you notice tablets carved with Latin inscriptions. Citizens long dead, their lives summed up in phrases you can only guess at. Here lies Aurelia, built 3 barns for her Lord with fervent faith. What does that fervent faith look like? You will never know. The church warden holds the only key to the tomb. And it's not just the written word. Oral tradition stories, songs, local lore has been stamped out as well. The devil hides in rumors. The priest preaches every Sunday. Listen only to the word. So folktales of clever foxes or protective forest spirits are discouraged. Played out by traveling minstrels? Too risky. A song about an unjust lord? That's subversive. You hear a line about a fox outsmarting a tyrant and glance around. Is that woodcutter listening? His eyes shift. He's a friendly man, but you decide not to finish the stanza. Knowledge is power. The church understood that long before lords realized it. And, like any savvy power, they built a fortress with walls of stone in the abbeys and walls of illiteracy in the villages. Within those walls, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, priceless works of Aristotle, Galen, Virgil, yet few ever saw them. Some argue the monks did it for posterity. Others say it was to inflate the church's glory. Look at these treasures. Pagan though they are, only the church can preserve them. Preservation or lockdown either way, you are locked out. You stand at the threshold of a knowledge vault, wanting to peek inside, but the heavy oak doors remain shut. And if you try to pick the lock learning to read, hunting for secret manuscripts, you risk excommunication, no more sacraments, no more burial in consecrated ground. Imagine your funeral, a cold winter day, a small hole in the frozen earth. Your friends huddle, singing prayers, but the priest refuses to bless your coffin. He stands back, silver crosses tucked away. The burial shovels scrape in silence. Your name fades in the wind, and no prayer carries you through, because you dared to learn. Is it any wonder that by the 10th century, peasants spoke of education like a fairy tale? A mythical realm where scholars debated in great halls, and where people could read their own property deeds without begging a priest. They told their children stories of Alexandria's libraries, though those were long burned, and of wandering scholars who taught beneath open skies. They spoke of them in whispers, as if summoning ghosts. Yet the church's fortress began to show cracks. Pilgrims traveled to distant abbeys and returned with fragments of knowledge, snippets of Greek, a taste of mathematics, the echo of philosophical debates. Merchant cities like Venice and Marseille buzzed with chatter of texts beyond Rome's reach. Occasionally, a noble's child would smuggle an Arabic translation of Archimedes or Avicenna texts on geometry, astronomy, medicine, and pass them to a curious monk who read them by lamplight. Small rebellions of the mind, flickers of light against the shadow of ignorance. But for the everyday peasant, the church's grip still meant that learning was a privilege, not a right. Knowledge was locked away in vaulted rooms, in secret scripts, and in priests' mouths. The power of the pen, of the printed word, if you ever glimpsed it, seemed as distant as the stars above the roof of the chapel. And you, standing in the morning sun just beyond those massive doors, realize that your battle isn't just with lords of flesh and blood. It's with an institution that has made silence into a sacred duty. The question echoes in your mind. How do you tear down walls built to be eternal? The answer, centuries later, would be simple. Words printed in every language. Schools for all. Libraries open to the public. But tonight, right now, the church's fortress stands tall, and you can only press your hand to its cold stones, hoping that one day the doors will swing wide. Until then, you keep searching, catching fragments of knowledge in market stalls, in whispered legends, in the few forbidden leaves smuggled out by traveling scholars. Like that hidden ember beneath the ash, it waits, ready to flare into a blaze the moment the wind changes. And oh, what a blaze that might be. A week has passed since that cold dawn in the chapel, yet your mind still clings to the hiss of candle flames licking ancient parchment. You've tasted the bitterness of forbidden knowledge, and now you hunger for more. But for most villagers, literacy is a phantom haunting distant halls, something heard of in legends, like dragons or a king's justice. In practice, the ability to read and write belongs to priests, nobles, and the occasional wandering clerk. For you, it's as unreachable as the moon. Think of books not dusty tomes chained to church lecterns, but the idea of a book, a collection of words bound together, able to ferry thoughts across valleys, borders, centuries. Imagine opening one and letting your eyes swim through stories, laws, recipes, or healing recipes that don't involve invoking devils. That's the promise of literacy. But in the Dark Ages, books were a treasure hoard guarded by monks who whispered Latin as if it were life's own heartbeat. You remember old Brother Thomas, a kindly soul with ink-stained fingers and a nervous cough. He once slipped you a scrap of vellum, an excerpt from a gospel in the vernacular. "Don't let them see," he'd whispered. "It's a sin to teach layfolk." You hid it beneath your tunic, and for a moment, you felt richer than any king. But you also felt the weight of a secret that could cost you everything. Why were books so rare? For one, parchment was made from animal skins stretched, scraped, soaked, and dried, a process so laborious that a single sheep could yield only a few pages. Ink came from oak galls or soot mixed with gum. Illustrations were hand-painted in lapis lazuli, a pigment so precious it sold for more than gold. And scribes copied by candlelight in monastery cells, their backs bent over benches, reciting psalms to keep their hands steady. By the time a book left those stone walls, it was a marvel, expensive, fragile, and marked with chains at the lectern to prevent it walking away on its own two legs. Yes, you heard stories of books walking down the aisle pranced by unseen forces, or so they said to keep you from hiding them in your cloak. Of course, the church argued that books needed protection from ignorant hands. If villagers grasped the written word, they might misinterpret dogma or question official translations. To preserve orthodoxy, the church monopolized manuscript production. Any unauthorized copying was deemed heresy, a word as chilling as any whip or iron. So you survive on scraps. A friend who can sign his name, 2 shaky letters, might write a brief note for a fee. A traveling merchant might hawk a few broadsheets, printed on rudimentary press proclamations of taxes or indulgent sellers' pitches, promising reduced time in purgatory. But those are sermons, not stories. And stories are what feed a mind. You recall the fairy tale of Aesop's fox, a cunning creature slipping by wolves and lions. You hear it in taverns, stretched and bent by bards who whisper only fragments for fear of the church's ear. Never trust the pious, the fox says in one fragment. In another, question the shepherd who guards the flock. But you never get the whole tale. Without books, the wheels of innovation stall. Healers rely on odd concoctions, crocodile dung for sunscreen, to treat skin ailments. Farmers guess at crop rotation cycles. Farmers' wives rely on lore passed by word-of-mouthsome memory of Roman techniques, but mostly local customs. A drought? Plant your seeds on Good Friday. A flood? Recite the Lord's Prayer at midnight. You buy a sheet of vellum at market. 1 sheet costs half a week's wages. You try jotting down your name, a few letters learned in secret. The marks wobble across the page like tiny birds unsure of flight. You imagine writing your own story, reflections on the Lord's cruelty, instructions for healing, questions about why the sky is blue. But then you remember that vellum belongs to the Lord, and if he sees it, he'll tear it apart. Or worse, books keep minds alive. Without them, knowledge thins until it disappears, like the echo of a song in an empty hall. And that's exactly what lords and priests want. A silent, obedient population that doesn't need to ask why. Yet the whispers persist. Scraps of parchment slip between bread loaves. A merchant's apprentice scribbles headings in the vernacular on recycled parchments. How to treat Hildlight or the tale of the wandering monk. Sometimes you barter eggs for these fragments. You huddle at night, candle flickering, reading aloud to your neighbor's children. They giggle at the strange letters dancing on the page. It's perilous work. Once, the reeve caught you and your neighbor reading a broken stanza of a hymn in French rather than Latin. He confiscated the vellum, beat your neighbor's knuckles, and sent him home with instructions to memorize only what the church taught. You left with bruised ribs and a burning resolve. If knowledge is this dangerous, it must be powerful. Even so, you persist. You learn runes, simple marks that merchants use on barrels to track taxes. You teach your wife to draw lines on broken pottery shards, matching shapes to sounds. Slowly, painfully, you relearn what centuries of scarcity have buried. And brilliant minds beyond your village begin chipping away at the monopoly. In distant Mainz, a craftsman invents a printing press. Movable type, they call it. Now, many can produce books faster than monks can copy. No vellum paper makers in Italy start using linen rags. Ink makers find cheaper dyes. Grain farmers suddenly have hope that knowledge might trickle down. But that world is not yet yours. For now, you are a book prisoner, your mind reaching for bars that are both literal and metaphorical. You write in your heart the words you cannot speak out loud. You memorize poems. You hide fragments in your straw mattress. And you teach your children songs with hidden meanings, so that when the time comes, they will read between the lines literally. In the darkest corner of your kitchen, beneath a loose floorboard, you stash the merchant's leaflet stales of mathematics, botany, even maps of cities that sparkle with libraries. There they rest, waiting for the day when you no longer need to fear them. Books may be chains to the uninitiated, but they are wings to those brave enough to learn. And courage grows in small acts, a crude letter traced on parchment, a whispered story in candlelight, a child learning to sound out a single word. Someday, those wings will carry more than you. They'll carry whole villages, whole kingdoms, into a world where knowledge isn't locked away behind cathedral gates. Until that day, you hold the books close, even if they weigh heavy with danger and hope. The morning sun filters through cracks in your cottage's wooden walls and falls on the hearth as embers. You stir the pot, rolling out dough for flatbread, while your wife hums a lullaby to your newborn. It should be a peaceful scene, but you both know better. A knock sounds at the door, sharp, insistent. You open it to find the reeve and two armed men blocking your threshold. In their hands, rolled up parchment sealed with the bishop's crest. Your wife halts mid-hum. The baby's cry stops. You swallow, heart pounding, as the reeve unseals the parchment with a snap. His eyes flit to your wife, then back to you. By order of the bishop, he intones, voice low as gravestones. Your wife stands accused of witchcraft. Your breath hitches. Witchcraft? You glance at your wife's hands that carried water from the well, kneaded dough, soothed your fever. Never once did she whisper spells. Yet knowledge of healing herbs alone was enough for suspicion. He unfolds the parchment and reads, "For employing devil's arts, administering herbal poultices, gathering in secret, and turning hearts from the true faith allegoria must stand trial by ordeal." You try to protest, "She's no witch," but the reeve's men close in. Within minutes, your wife is bound, her arms pinned behind her, wrists chafed by coarse rope. The baby's wails echo in the doorway as they haul her away. You grasp the infant, arms trembling, and watch your world fracture. Women, especially those with healing skills, with knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters, were the first targets in the church's campaign to control minds and bodies. The role of midwife, herbalist, or wise woman predates Christendom. For centuries, women alone tended births, delivered infants, brewed salves from plant roots, and kept communities alive through droughts, fevers, and injuries. But that autonomy terrified men, lords, and clergy alike, because a woman who heals is a woman who thinks, questions, and wields knowledge not granted by the church. Control the healer, and you control the people. So, with the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 and subsequent papal bulls, the church codified suspicion. Women who gathered at night to share herbal lore were implicated in secret covens. Any woman whose knowledge outshone simple prayers was rumored to sing chants beneath moonlight, calling on spirits to curse the pious. When your wife is dragged into the village square, a crowd gathers. Many have benefited from her care, your neighbor's feverish son, the reeve's own crippled brother. Yet fear is a stronger bond than gratitude. You hear whispers. She made bells ring in the dead of night. Her poultices glowed with unnatural light. I saw her hands floating over the dead root, reading secret incantations. The priest arrives, flanked by two monks in black cowls. He holds up a thick leather tome, Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hammer, its pages filled with doctrine, instructing how to identify, interrogate, and destroy witches. Scholars later call it misogynistic drivel, but in this moment, it is law. Trial by ordeal awaits. They bind your wife to a stake and prepare a trial by water. If she floats, she's a witch and must be executed. If she sinks, she's innocent, but likely drowns before anyone can rescue her. You glare at the splintered stake, your knuckles white around the baby. Villagers lower her into the wooden tub. The water accepts her weight. She does not sink. She bobs on the surface like a lost doll, arms floating. A murmur travels. She's touched by evil. The priest lifts a hand. Bind her tighter. prepare the firewood. Your world tilts. You step forward, voice trembling. She's a midwife, not a witch. A monk raises his staff, cutting you off. You stumble backward. Your wife, tears streaming, tries to smile at you, her fingers scrabbling against the rope. She mouths, "Our child." Her lips part, but sound cannot pass. Flames are lit, smoke curling into the sky. She is taken from the water and tied to the pyre. As the fire grows, her screams split the air, mingling with the baby's cry. You press the child to your chest, tears blurring the scene. This horror was repeated thousands of times across Europe. Women who offered healing or who simply existed outside narrowly defined roles fell victim to suspicion and ecclesiastical zeal. The church's alliance with feudal lords meant trials were swift, punishment public, and fear absolute. Court records show names burned, sometimes with details exaggerated for effect. Eyewitnesses declare her incantations rattled chamber doors at midnight. By the 15th century, inquisitors moved from town to town, armed with lists of signs, warts, earthmarks, knowledge of the nightshade plant. Every woman with a secret garden became suspect. Old women grinding wheat at the mill were accused of cursing the baker's oven. Sisters caring for the infirm risked stumbles someone died under their watch, and suddenly the devil's work. Your grief hardens into determination. You take your baby and flee first to a neighboring parish, then to the outlaw bands rumored deep in the forests. There, among fugitives, you learn hidden healing arts, carried in whispered chants and obscure scroll fragments. You meet women and men who teach you to use herbs without inference to devils, to read signs in the constellations rather than papal decrees. It's an underground network shadows teaching shadows. They speak of a time beyond stakes and flames. They speak of medical schools in far-off cities, where men and women learn anatomy from dissecting bodies, though that too is heresy in many lands. They speak of ancient Greek physicians whose works, once banned, are now studied by a few brave scholars. In the hush of nighttime, around fires, these exiles share knowledge. How to distinguish wormwood from parsley. How to treat wounds with boiling vinegar. How to ease childbirth pain with willow bark tea. They trade broken vellum pages, fragments of Greek texts, and, most importantly, hope. Your baby grows under this clandestine tutelage, learning to forge roots before he can talk. You carve crude letters into bark, teaching him to write, to question, to remember the names of plants, not the words of priests. And though your wife never returns from that stake, her memory lives in every salve you apply, every life you save, every tale you whisper to your child of a mother who burned, but whose spirit endures. You carry her forward. For in every life saved by secret medicine, in every parent who dares to teach children forbidden letters, the church's power dims. Each clandestine lesson is a spark tiny flickering against centuries of fear. When finally the winds change, when reformers challenge papal edicts, when printing presses spread medical treatises to curious minds, the fires will still burn in memory. But they will also become beacons, reminders of the cost of silence, proof of the strength of knowledge, passed hand to hand, heart to heart. Tonight, as you tuck your child into bed beneath a humble thatch, you whisper, "She lives in you." And you close the door softly, heart steady with the promise that witch hunts will one day belong only to dark fairy tales. A chill wind rattles the shutters as dusk falls, and you find yourself near the old preaching cross at the village edge, overhearing two cloaked figures. One whispers, "Have you read the new Malleus Maleficarum?" The other nods, eyes wide with both fascination and fear. With that, you realize something terrible. Witch hunts have become an industry green-lit by the highest authorities, perfected by manuals, and carried out like clockwork across Europe. It began in 1484, when Pope Innocent VIII issued the bull Summus Desiderantis Effectibus. He wrote of an appalling number of heretics, called witches, and granted Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger extraordinary powers to root out witchcraft. It was as if he'd handed them a blank check to terrorize women whose only crime might be knowing too much about roots and salves. Perhaps the very knowledge used for that crocodile dung sunscreen recipe you laughed about earlier, but that no one would dare test now without fearing a stake. 2 years later, Kramer and Sprenger published their notorious pamphlet, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This wasn't a gentle outline. It was a gruesome toolkit. They detailed how to identify witches by birthmarks, how to extract confessions with prayerful torture, and how to justify executions under the banner of holy duty. Page after page mapped the procedure: interrogation, torture, judgment, pyre. It read like a business plan, profitless, soul-destroying business. Imagine an inquisitor riding into a small town. In his saddlebag, a copy of the Malleus, a bishop's commission, iron manacles, a set of sharp needles for pricking suspected marks, and enough faggots for several pyres. He'd set up court in the village square, under banners proclaiming God's justice. Crowds gathered, drawn by curiosity and terror. Local magistrates, often eager to prove loyalty, lent him livestock and grain for lodging. Merchants sold ropes and chains. Servants earned wages hauling firewood. Over time, witch trials became a grim economic opportunity, a chance for lords to seize property from accused heretics, and for towns to display piety in spectacular fashion. Trials followed a sinister choreography. First, accusation. Neighbors pointed fingers, often settling old grudges under cover of sanctity. "She cursed my cow," one cried. "Her children danced naked in the moonlight," said another. Innocent questions swelled into public hysteria. The accused were brought forth, bound in chains forged for the purpose, eyes wild with fear. An inquisitor read from the Malleus, reciting a litany of possible sins, familiars, Sabbaths, pacts with demons. The prisoner, trembling, heard that silence is a sign of guilt. Speak or be silent, both led to torment. Next came the tests. Needles pricked skin until the tiniest spot bled. Did it bleed? Must be the devil's mark. Then the thumbscrew, which crushed flesh inch by inch pain, measured not by mercy, but by confession. "Tell the truth," cried the inquisitor. Under that cruel apparatus, a woman might scream a laundry list of imagined witches, each name fueling the trial network, setting new inquiries in motion in nearby villages. If she confessed, a plea bargain of sorts awaited. Repent, and you will be spared the stake. But repenting meant denouncing others, daughters, sisters, neighbors, spreading the net ever wider. Refuse, and the final act unfolded, the execution. Bound to a stake, the condemned woman would be wheeled onto pyre wood, feet secured to the stones. A shroud covered her face, a merciful veil, they claimed, a final prayer uttered, a torch applied. The flames consumed flesh and hope in a single moment. While flames crackled, villagers often cheered or wept, complex emotions born of indoctrination and fear. A child might watch, cheeks flushed, believing this was divine mercy. Mothers might clutch infants, tears streaking soot-smudged faces. And merchants sold pies and ale at square gates, capitalizing on sorrow like any festival. Through it all, the church's imprimatur loomed large. Bishops sent letters praising inquisitors' zeal. Popes issued indulgences, discounted years in purgatory for those funding witch hunts. Local lords adopted witch trials as a demonstration of loyalty, using seized property to rebuild castles or endow chapels. The killing of evil became a civic celebration. Yet, even in this machinery of death, flickers of irony appeared. Some inquisitors complained that towns were overcrowded with suspects. Why, 2/3 of women over 60 could be accused simply for living too long. Others grumbled that it was expensive. Wood, torturers, guards. One exasperated inquisitor reportedly mused, "If the devil is so active, he must be quite industrious, or we are simply too idle." Despite the cost, the Malleus's influence spread relentlessly. Translated into multiple tongues, it became the standard witch-hunting manual across Catholic and Protestant lands alike. Germany saw trials that claimed thousands of lives. Switzerland and parts of France followed. Even isolated English hamlets held dunking trials, where local parishes raised funds from convicted witches' properties. Each region added its own twist, but the core methodology, accusation, torture, confession, seizure of goods, remained identical. And so, what began as sporadic hunts turned into an empire of fear. Witch-finders traveled from village to village, hawking their expertise like peddlers. Some were charlatans, tapping into collective dread. They demonstrated proof by summoning mice during rituals, claiming the demons had revealed themselves. They set up booths outside markets, selling tracts on witchcraft and demanding donations for their next mission. By the mid-17th century, traveling witch hunters were quasi-celebrities, public figures, as recognized as any minstrels or pint-pouring innkeeper. Parents told tales of them to discipline rowdy children. Eat your porridge, or the witch-finder will come for you. The very idea of witch-finders became a tool of control, their memory haunting generations. Of course, not everyone cheered. A small but growing dissent rose among scholars, jurists, and even some clergy who saw the Malleus's logic for the absurdity it was. They pointed out glaring contradictions. By their own rules, men could be witches too, but male executions were far fewer. They questioned how torture-induced confessions could ever be reliable. They argued that property confiscations incentivized false accusations. Slowly, voices of reason gained ground. Some judges demanded higher standards of proof. Some princes decreed no more torture. A handful of pamphlets circulated criticizing the Malleus as heretical in its own right, calling for its condemnation. But these voices were whispers in a storm, and often ended in exile or worse. Yet, every whisper chipped away at the edifice. Over decades, the fever broke. By the late 18th century, witch hunting as an institution was dying. Courts disbanded witch orders. Manuals gathered dust in archives. But the legacy remained a cautionary tale of what happens when power, fear, and bureaucracy converge into a deadly enterprise. Imagine standing in the same square centuries later. No pyres, no shackles, just children playing tag around the empty pillar where once inquisitors held court. A plaque honors those unjustly persecuted. Yet beneath the stone, centuries of ashes wait, ashes of women and men whose only crime was knowledge, independence, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. When you recall your wife's ordeal, her trial by water, her silent bravery, you now see it as part of a vast machine. A machine that counted profits in land seized, reputations crushed, and communities terrorized. A machine built by expert architects of faith, fueled by fear, and fine-tuned by the Malleus Maleficarum. But even that machine wasn't invincible. Resistance grew in hidden libraries, in reformist sermons, in courtrooms demanding due process. The story of witch hunts eventually became a ghost story, a warning about fanaticism and unchecked power. As night deepens and stars blink overhead, you may feel relief that such horrors belong to history. But remember this: tyranny is not extinguished once and for all. It sleeps, waiting for manuals, decrees, and human fear to awaken it again. Now the moon casts its silver over mossy stone and muddy ruts as we make our way toward the heart of medieval entertainment, if you can call it that. Picture a crowd gathered in the town square, shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting in the air, as a drum roll signals the beginning of an execution. Not a noble act of justice, but a public spectacle, a performance, grotesque and magnetic, a strange blend of punishment and pageantry. You might think, Surely not everyone came willingly to these events, but oh, they did. Executions in the Middle Ages were as well attended as market fairs and religious festivals. In fact, they were scheduled to ensure maximum turnout. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts and sour ale. Children sat on shoulders for a better view. And musicians, yes, sometimes musicians played flutes or fiddles before the real drama began. But what kind of punishments drew such crowds? Let's start with hanging, perhaps the most standard of medieval deaths. Still, it wasn't always so simple. In some cases, the condemned were made to walk barefoot through town while being pelted with mud or offal. By the time they reached the gallows, their dignity had been stripped away like bark from a tree. And the noose? Sometimes it snapped the neck swiftly, but other times the victim writhed for minutes, a silent dance of agony that captivated the crowd. The more he struggled, the more raucous the audience became. And just before death, someone might lean in to whisper, "Confess, and the angels may yet find you." Or maybe not. Then there was the pillory, a wooden contraption that locked a person's head and hands in place. A person might stand in it for hours or days, unable to wipe away the rotten tomatoes, or worse, hurled by delighted children. It wasn't a death sentence, but it was death to one's reputation, social standing, and sense of safety. And for some, that shame hurt more than broken bones ever could. Still too tame? Let's go a notch darker. Enter drawing and quartering, a punishment so gruesome it almost defies belief. Reserved for high treason like trying to harm the king, it began with the condemned being dragged to the execution site by horse or cart, not led, dragged. Next came hanging, but only partially. The executioner ensured the person didn't die. Then came the knife. The stomach was opened, and the entrails pulled out, sometimes burned before the victim's eyes. After death, the body was beheaded, and the limbs severed, quartered. These parts were then sent to the far reaches of the kingdom, mounted on spikes to warn anyone even thinking about defying the crown. And the crowd watched, silent during the slicing, perhaps, but not absent. It was expected. It was ordered. It was theater with blood instead of curtains. But not all executions were about kings and traitors. Some were deeply personal, such as for adultery, theft, or blasphemy. A woman caught in a love affair might be buried alive up to her neck, left to the elements while passers-by jeered. A man caught stealing from a church might have his tongue ripped out, a lesson in both theft and speech. And for those who dared question the doctrines of the day, burning was the sentence, not because it was quick, but because it was symbolic. Fire purified. Fire cleansed. Fire showed the town that heresy would never, ever be tolerated. Inquisitors and magistrates often designed punishments to fit the crime in a twisted kind of logic. A dishonest merchant might be boiled in oil. A coin-clipping counterfeiter could be melted with the same silver he debased. There's a chilling cleverness in how personalized each horror was. And here's where it becomes even more surreal. Entertainers sometimes performed before or after executions. Tumblers flipped, minstrels sang, and puppeteers might tell cautionary tales about the condemned. Children mimicked the punishments in street games, tying strings around toy dolls and pretending to hang them. A joke might follow. What did the thief say before he was drawn and quartered? "I hope they get my good side." The crowd would laugh. Gallows humor, quite literally. Now imagine you're part of that crowd. You know the person about to be executed. Maybe they stole bread for their starving child, or whispered doubts about a local priest. You know they're not evil, but you also know the price of saying so aloud. The town watches you watching them. You clap along, maybe laugh at a joke you don't find funny, because survival depends on not standing out. There's something monstrous and deeply human in that moment. Execution days were also ritualized. Church bells tolled. A priest often walked beside the condemned, urging repentance. Sometimes the victim spoke final words, offering apologies, prayers, or defiant last lines that became local legend. One tale tells of a young woman accused of sorcery, who, before the fire was lit, turned to the crowd and said, "Today I burn, but tomorrow you'll miss my cures." People remembered that. They always remember the last thing a person says before the flames consume them. Sometimes a stay of execution came at the last second. A royal pardon, a new confession, a noble stepping in with coin or favor. And the crowd would groan not out of compassion, but disappointment. The show was canceled. Return to your homes, your chores, your dull routines. No screams today. Yet not all executions ended lives. Some ended social existence. A public whipping could mark someone forever. A branding iron might burn a letter into their skin. T for thief, H for heretic. These marks spoke louder than any record. Wherever that person went, their past followed a scarlet whisper on flesh. Execution sites themselves became hallowed or haunted places. Some towns built permanent gallows just outside the city gates. The air around them always smelled a little off iron and earth. Birds roosted nearby, waiting for leftovers. Over time, these spots gained names like Dead Man's Cross or Noose Hill. Children were dared to walk there after dark. Lovers carved their initials on the wood of long-forgotten platforms. Life went on around death. It always did. By the late medieval period, some rulers began to question these spectacles. Not out of compassion, mind you, but optics. Foreign ambassadors winced at blood-soaked scaffolds. Philosophers whispered about dignity. And slowly, very slowly, a shift began. Executions moved to quieter locations. Torture chambers became secrets, not shows. Public hangings became private. But for centuries before that, punishment was performance. So next time you pass an empty square or a quiet hill on your travels, pause and listen. Maybe you'll hear echoes cheering, drums rolling, fire crackling. Maybe, just maybe, the wind will carry the faint smell of ash and iron. Not to frighten, but to remind. Even justice can be twisted when made a spectacle. The fire from the execution grounds still crackles faintly in memory as we move forward, not to another square, but into the quiet confines of a stone chamber where faith meets fear, and where a priest's robe hides the tools of torment. Welcome to the chilling dominion of the Inquisition, and the shadowy rituals that punished heresy in the name of salvation. Picture a dimly lit room, windowless, with thick, damp air clinging to the stone. A single candle flickers beside a table stacked with scrolls, iron tools, and a crucifix. Here, beneath the guise of holy justice, men in robes would decide whether someone was a faithful servant of God or a servant of Satan. The Inquisition, particularly the later Roman and Spanish branches, didn't invent religious persecution, but they turned it into a science. Whisper a doubt about church doctrine. Read a banned book, or worse, translate scripture into your native tongue, and suddenly you could vanish. Just like that. Accusations didn't always come from authority figures. Neighbors, jealous rivals, or even family members could denounce someone, sometimes out of true belief, sometimes out of spite. One rumor and you were invited for questioning. But you never left the same person, if you left at all. Now you might be picturing racks and iron maidens, but the Inquisition's first tool was far more subtle: interrogation under spiritual pressure. Interrogators would begin gently. Are you aware you've been accused? Would you like to confess to save your soul? A false sense of calm. They offered confession, repentance, and warned of the greater pain to come if one remained silent. But silence was suspicious. Protesting innocence was suspicious. Even weeping too much or too little could be suspicious. Logic didn't apply here. The goal wasn't truth, it was compliance. If the accused didn't confess, then came the persuasion. Let's ease into the medieval arsenal of torture, one cruel step at a time. There was the strapado, where a person's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted upward by rope, then suddenly dropped, stopping just before hitting the ground. The jolt dislocated the shoulders instantly. Sometimes weights were added to the feet for extra persuasion. And here's the part that haunts. They did this in complete silence. No screams from the victim were allowed to reach the public. This was not entertainment. This was controlled terror. Then came the rack, a long frame where victims were stretched until tendons snapped and joints popped like kindling. The executioner turned the wheel slowly, with methodical precision. Not enough to kill, just enough to unravel. To make the prisoner willing to say anything, accuse anyone, believe anything. Need something quieter? Enter water torture. No, not the cinematic kind. Here, the accused would be tied on their back and cloth pushed deep into the throat while water was poured in, mimicking the sensation of drowning. Over and over, they choked on the fear of death without ever quite meeting it. Some methods were more psychological. For instance, solitary confinement in absolute darkness. No light, no sound, no sense of time. Some broke in hours, others after days. A few were driven mad, whispering confessions to shadows. One might ask, what were they trying to extract? Good question. Often, it was a list. Names of fellow heretics, secret meetings, foreign sympathizers. The accused might be ordered to name people they didn't even know. If they refused, more torture. If they did, the names were followed up and more were arrested. A self-feeding cycle of fear. But even if you confessed under duress, that wasn't enough. You had to repeat your confession without torture later. If you changed a word, you were deemed deceptive and the process started again. And here's a terrifying detail. Many of those tortured didn't understand why they were there. Literacy was rare and doctrine complicated. Some were accused of heresy simply for questioning why a priest rode a horse while their children starved, or for using herbal remedies seen as pagan. One woman was condemned for claiming she'd felt closer to God while walking in a meadow than in church. That was enough. The church kept detailed records. We still have them. Trial transcripts, torture logs, final confessions. Some read like horror scripts, others like poetry from broken minds. One man, a scribe, when asked why he stopped attending church, simply said, "I heard the bells and stayed in bed." That was it. He died under questioning. Now, let's be clear. Not every accused person was tortured. Some confessed immediately. Some were merely fined or forced to perform public penance, marching barefoot through the streets, wearing a conical hat and a tunic with a heretic symbol on it. Shame was a powerful deterrent. But if torture didn't lead to death, execution often did. Many heretics were sentenced to burning at the stake, the ultimate punishment. It wasn't always fast. Wood was sometimes dampened to prolong the process. Victims were tied tightly, and a priest stood nearby urging last-minute repentance. Those who confessed might be strangled first, a mercy. Those who refused, well, even in death, the church controlled the narrative. Ashes were often scattered in rivers to prevent martyrdom. Families of the accused could be fined, land seized, names erased from records. Yet here's the bitter irony. These methods were not universally condemned. Many believed they were saving souls. That torment in this life prevented eternal damnation. That pain was temporary, but hell was forever. The Inquisition's cruelty wasn't always powered by sadism, but by certainty. And sometimes, certainty is more dangerous than hate. Some monks, when not torturing, prayed for the victims they'd broken. Some wept. One inquisitor wrote in his journal, "I cannot sleep for the cries, yet I cannot stop the work, for I believe it righteous." That sentence may be the most haunting of all. But something began to shift. As the centuries wore on, cracks appeared. Philosophers, early scientists, and quiet rebels began to whisper. Should faith really require fire? Protestants challenged the authority of Rome. Gutenberg's printing press spread unsanctioned texts faster than the Inquisition could burn them. Slowly, painfully, the light began to leak into those dark chambers. By the 17th century, torture began to lose favor in many parts of Europe. The Inquisition remained active, but its power waned. Trials still happened, but they weren't public. Confessions became subtler, and one by one, nations turned away from the idea that pain could purify belief. Still, the shadow remains. Today, we look back on the Inquisition as a lesson in how dogma, unchecked, can decay into tyranny. How even noble intentions can mask horror, and how silence from the good allows cruelty to thrive. So if you find yourself questioning the accepted path, asking difficult questions, or seeking truth in forbidden places, remember this. In another time, that curiosity might have cost you everything, and all it would have taken was a whisper, a jealous eye, or a mistaken word in a town square. The echoes of iron chains and whispered accusations may now fade behind us, but the chilling legacy of the Inquisition did not dissolve quietly. Tonight, we press further into the labyrinth of medieval mindsets, where disease, demons, and dread merged into a worldview that left no room for reason. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine, or perhaps more fittingly, the absence of it. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village. The roads are muddy, the homes timber-framed and drafty, and the scent of damp hay lingers in the air. Someone sneezes in the distance, a wet, hacking sound. A child lies sweating in bed, her face flushed. The local physician arrives not with a stethoscope or thermometer, but with a sack of leeches and a chart of the moon's phases. Because in the Dark Ages, illness wasn't biological. It was spiritual, or worse, astrological. Let's start with the most influential medical theory of the time, the four humors. Derived from ancient Greek thought, particularly Hippocrates and Galen, this theory suggested that the human body was made up of four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness resulted from an imbalance of these. Too melancholic. Clearly, your black bile is high. Feeling hot and angry? Yellow bile. The doctor might bleed you, induce vomiting, or recommend a cooling diet of cucumbers. But here's the trick. None of it worked, and often the treatment left you worse off than the disease. Then there was the ever-reliable bloodletting, a medieval pastime so popular it was practically seasonal. Leeches on the temples, veins opened with knives or lancets. Monks would bleed themselves during Lent as spiritual cleansing. Royal physicians bled kings for headaches and peasants for tummy aches. Sometimes the result wasn't healing, it was unconsciousness. Or, well, a permanent nap. But why the obsession with bodily fluids? Part of it was control. Medical explanations had to align with religious belief. Illness couldn't just be physical, it had to be moral. If you were sick, it wasn't because your drinking water was contaminated. It was because you sinned. You disobeyed the church. You weren't praying hard enough. So the logical solution? Confession, prayer, holy relics, and yes, exorcism. Let's not gloss over this. The church's grasp over medicine was so absolute that scientific autopsies were forbidden. The human body was sacred. To cut into it was to blaspheme. So most knowledge about anatomy came from guesswork or translated scraps from ancient texts, many of which were riddled with errors. A medieval doctor might confidently declare that the liver produced thought, or that a woman's womb wandered freely around her body, causing hysteria. Sound ridiculous? That's because it was, but that didn't stop them from making decisions based on these theories. And as we said before, reason was never the first priority, obedience was. Now let's introduce a figure both feared and revered, the barber surgeon. Not only could your local barber cut your hair, he could remove a tooth, set a broken bone, or perform battlefield surgery, usually with no anesthesia, of course. His tools were soaked in vinegar, and his surgical techniques, let's just say he relied more on strength than precision. And yes, this same man could also give you a fresh bowl cut after amputating your toe. A multitasker. Medicine wasn't just misinformed, it was deeply intertwined with superstition. Have a fever? Sleep with a crucifix under your pillow. Can't sleep? Rub mashed owl brains on your forehead. Eyesight failing? Boil a toad and drink the broth. These weren't jokes. These were actual prescriptions often found in the period's medical manuscripts. But nothing, absolutely nothing, tested medieval medicine like the arrival of the Black Death. Around 1347, the bubonic plague entered Europe, likely via merchant ships from the east. What followed was one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. By some estimates, up to 50% of Europe's population perished in just a few years. The reactions were a mix of panic, hysteria, and deep, deep ignorance. Doctors wore long robes, gloves, and those infamous plague masks with bird-like beaks. The beaks were stuffed with herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, believed to purify the air. The plague was thought to travel via miasma, or bad air, so blocking one's nose became a popular though ultimately useless strategy. And yet, these eerie masks, while ineffective, were one of the first recorded examples of personal protective equipment. Ironically, they may have helped a little by accident, since they reduced exposure to bodily fluids. But the doctors who wore them had little idea why. The plague also gave rise to another dangerous belief: scapegoating. With no understanding of bacteria or rats, people turned on minority communities, especially Jews. Wild conspiracy theories spread like, well, the plague claiming that Jewish people had poisoned wells or cast curses. Pogroms erupted across Europe, with entire communities massacred based on paranoia. Cities like Strasbourg and Mainz saw thousands of Jews burned alive or drowned in rivers, all while the real culprit, Yersinia pestis, multiplied in flea-ridden rats. And what of the church? Its answer to the plague was more prayer, more penance, and sometimes more punishment. Flagellant groups, bands of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody, believed the plague was God's wrath. They sang hymns, begged forgiveness, and spread the disease further with every town they visited. Oh, and remember that autopsies were banned? This restriction meant no understanding of how the disease worked. Without medical research, the infection ran wild. Priests refused to bury the dead. Graveyards overflowed. Entire villages vanished. But not all hope was lost. In a few corners of Europe, a quiet rebellion brewed. Pragmatic thinkers, still influenced by ancient texts, began to question the status quo. Some towns implemented early quarantines, locking ships offshore for 40 days, or isolating households. In Italy, public health boards began to appear. It was not a revolution yet, but the embers of science had been lit. Still, for most medieval people, illness remained a divine mystery. And if it didn't kill you, the cure just might. By now, you might be wondering, with all this death, all this suffering, how did anyone trust authority? Why didn't people rise up? The truth is chillingly simple. Most didn't know any better. Illiteracy was rampant. Books were scarce, written in Latin, and guarded by the clergy. To question official medicine was to question God's design. So people accepted their fate, prayed harder, and endured. One medieval proverb put it best: better to die faithful than to live cursed. Grim words for a grim age. Yet, in the shadows of sickness, a new era prepared to rise. Next, we'll walk through the fog of mysticism and mass hallucination, where entire towns lost their minds to music, prophecy, and mushrooms. Yes, the madness is only beginning. Dawn breaks over the village, but the air feels heavy thick with dread rather than mist. You emerge from your cottage, blinking against the pale light, only to see that the world itself has changed overnight. Doors hang open, shells of homes stand silent, and the usual cocks crow are answered by eerie quiet. This is the Black Death, or Cara Viva, as some whisper in trembling voices, and it will reshape everything you know. It began in 1347, carried on rats aboard merchant ships that docked at bustling ports. In the space of days, high-born nobles and lowly laborers alike found themselves covered in swelling buboes, grotesque lumps in the armpits, neck, or groin. Fever-scorched flesh, chills rattled bones, and a cough splattered droplets of infection in every breath. People fell sick in the morning and died by dusk. No amount of prayer, leeching, or plague mask could stop it. Imagine the chaos. The miller's daughter, you watched her play tag only yesterday, now lies on straw, groaning. Her father, in panic, attempts a diet of garlic and vinegar, convinced it will stave off miasma. His wife, urging him to fetch the priest, accidentally infects him in the cramped hut. The priest arrives, blesses the family, then falls ill himself, his ornate vestments soaked with sweat that drips onto those he tries to comfort. Soon, the village priest is gone. So is the reeve. Bodies pile in corners. Each corpse is a grenade of contagion. No one dares approach. You hear of mass graves trenches deep enough that shovels red with blood and mud appear like grave candles. Gravediggers, often convicts or desperate outcasts, are paid in coin laced with fever, and they, too, vanish after a handful of graves. The church, paralyzed by panic, alternates between condemning the plague as divine wrath and saying it has no explanation in Holy Scripture. When prayers fail, some priests flee. Others lock the church doors and crowbar the keys. Faith, once the villagers' anchor, snaps in a storm of terror. You clutch your child close, thinking, if God wanted me safe, wouldn't he have spared the priest? Mercifully, not all knowledge vanished in that suffocating fog. A handful of pragmatic souls, doctors, scholars, surgeons, began to take notes. They observed that families who quarantined tended to fare slightly better. They noted that rats scurried away from corpses. They started burning bedding. These early epidemiologists, though ridiculed as heretics, passed down scraps of wisdom. Clean your hands. Avoid contact. Watch the rats. Meanwhile, the general population turns to extremes. Flagellants march through the streets, flogging themselves until flesh shines like raw apples, believing self-inflicted pain can appease divine fury. Their cries, penance, penance, draw crowds. Yet where they pass, the infection often follows, carried on unwashed clothing, close crowds, and spilled blood. Elsewhere, desperate villagers scapegoat vulnerable groups, beggars, gypsies, and especially Jews. Insane rumors claim wells have been poisoned. In city after city, mobs drag Jewish families from homes, douse them with kindling, and light the fuse. Even the great synagogue of Strasbourg is set aflame as screams pierce the smoke. In memory, the village woodcutter swears he heard mothers wailing. They killed our neighbors to save us. A grotesque logic, but it underlines how fear warps the mind. Amid this horror, something unexpected stirs in the ruins. Fields lie fallow as farmers die in droves. Who will sow the seeds? Who will reap the harvest? The shortage of laborers gives surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. No longer shackled by crippling taxes, you can demand better wages or move to a nearby town offering work. Skilled tradesmen, blacksmiths, masons, carpenters are suddenly in short supply and in high demand. You watch, slack-jawed, as the reeve himself negotiates with you, hat in hand, to rebuild bridges and granaries. This shift heralds the end of the feudal order. Lords, once secure in their control of labor, face empty fields and coffers drained by medical costs and mass burials. To entice survivors, they grant charters freedoms to hold land. to sell produce at markets, to pay fixed rents rather than endless tithes. The old contract of oppression cracks, and a new social order rises from the ashes. Back in the village, those who survive begin to question authority. They demand clear records of rents. They insist on written agreements in English or French rather than Latin, so that none can manipulate them. The church, having lost credibility as healer of souls, finds fewer attendants in its pews. Alternative gatherings spring up, lay preachers in barns, study circles in open fields, groups convening to share practical knowledge about plague prevention and herbal cures. Cities grow as survivors flock from the decimated countryside, yearning for work and anonymity. Guilds form to protect skilled laborers, tailors, bakers, masons, offering insurance against illness, setting wages, and establishing mutual support. These guilds, early unions of sorts, not only stabilize the economy, but also nurture a culture of shared responsibility and collective bargaining, a far cry from feudal isolation. By the time the plague fades, waves ebbing, then surging again over decades, the old world is irreversibly altered. Populations may bounce back, but the memory of collapse endures. Peasants no longer see themselves as mere cogs in a lord's machine. They envision towns governed by councils, by charters, by written laws. They whisper dreams of universities where anyone can learn, and of parliaments where all voices are heard. Not every village changes overnight. Traditional power structures persist in pockets. The church adapts by offering more practical aid hospitals staffed by nuns and lay sisters, hospitals that treat the body as well as the soul. Over time, religious orders like the Augustinians and Franciscans establish infirmaries, teaching rudimentary sanitation measures that stem from plague lore. Yet the most profound transformation is psychological. After witnessing the fragility of life and the collapse of institutions once thought invincible, people embrace innovation and humanism. They ask, if God allowed this suffering, perhaps understanding the world through reason could prevent it. This spark feeds the embers of the Renaissance. So as you tread the same muddy lane where bodies once lay unburied, hear the hum of new workshops, smell baking bread in community ovens, see children learning to read their own names, hints of a brighter dawn born from darkest night. European society, scarred and humbled, begins its slow, determined climb toward modernity. In that transformation lies hope, that from the depths of tragedy emerges a more equitable, inquisitive world, one where knowledge is shared, rights are held, and fear does not reign supreme. The hush that followed the plague's devastation gave rise to a curiosity as vast as the night sky itself. As survivors grappled with fresh air and new freedoms, they also gazed upward, searching for answers in the stars. Because in the Dark Ages, illness wasn't just in the body, it was written across the heavens. Astromedicine reigned supreme, blending superstition, ancient lore, and a glimpse of proto-science. Your local healer sets up her tent outside the village church, strange, but not unheard of. Within, she keeps charts dotted with tiny crosses and circles, tracking planetary positions. She consults astronomical tables, rudimentary star maps, copied from Arabic scholars or dusty Roman codices. A snippet in Arabic script slipped out of a caravan's pack, traded quietly at the market, and now illuminates her practice. Here's how it works. Each illness corresponds to a planet or constellation. Fevers? That's Mars, wrathful, fiery. Infestations of parasites? They belong to Jupiter, expanding, exuberant. Digestive troubles trace back to Mercury, the fleet-footed messenger. Even the phases of the moon, new moon, full moon, eclipses affect your body's humoral balance, dictating when to sow seeds, when to harvest herbs, and yes, when to bleed. Imagine you awaken one morning with unbearable stomach pains, your insides twisting like lines. You stumble to her tent. She consults her charts. Mars currently resides in Capricorn, but Venus crosses the horizon at sunrise. That means your bile is overheated, Perhaps you've angered a neighbor in secret? Or eaten too much salted pork? The cure is twofold. First, a poultice made of ground rose petals blended with willow bark, applied to your temple at dawn. Then, you must fast until the moon reaches its zenith and drink a tincture brewed with mugwort and wine, ideally as Jupiter enters Libra. She hands you a small leather satchel containing these ingredients, along with a poem verses to recite as you prepare the concoction. By lunar light and whispered plea, Venus, calm my fiery sea. You accept the satchel, gingerly balancing it in your arms. You realize that the rhyme, while soothing, also encodes when and how to mix the herbs, an ancient mnemonic device disguised as verse. But this celestial approach had limitations. For every success, a fever that subsided, a cough that eased, a dozen failures produced wasted herbs and weakened bodies. And when treatments went wrong, blame often fell on the patient's lack of ritual purity, failure to recite the verse perfectly, or to wash the chalice in holy water. The ritual around healing became as crucial as the ingredients, binding medicine to religious observance. Astromedicine's roots trace back to Ptolemy and Hellenistic astrology, but it was energized by Arabic scholars Avicenna, Al-Razi, and others, whose works filtered through translations in Spain and Sicily. Monks at Monte Cassino or Toledo's libraries labored to copy these manuscripts, sometimes annotating them with local wisdom. In 1123, patient healed with mandrake when Venus was rising. Beyond individual treatments, entire calendars emerged physicians' almanacs. These booklets advised lay people on when to plant, when to bleed, when to harvest healing plants, and even when to marry. Traveling merchants carried pocket almanacs tied with string. Wealthier towns sold illuminated versions festooned with zodiac symbols sketched in gold leaf. Hold one aloft, and you'd see tiny figures of a ram for Aries, a crab for Cancer, scribbled beside instructions. Avoid bloodletting when the moon is in Cancer, because Cancer governs fluids. Fertility, too, was mapped by stars. A couple desperate for a child might consult both a priest and an astrologer. One would offer prayers and sacraments. The other advised positions under the waxing moon, timing relations to when Jupiter trine Mars believed to enhance virility. Such practices blurred the line between spiritual and physical, weaving hope and desperation into a tapestry of starlight and ritual. Yet astromedicine carried a kernel of genuine innovation, the linking of celestial observation with empirical outcomes. Healers noted patterns bouts of illness following comets, or seasonal fevers tied to planetary alignments. Scholars at Salerno and Padua debated these findings, laying early groundwork for combining observation with theory. The Church tolerated such studies. As long as astrology remained subservient to divine will, stars could guide, but only God determined fate. Still, astromedicine faced critics. Some theologians condemned it as pagan divination, masking witchcraft under scholarly guise. In 1277, Bishop Tempier condemned 70 propositions, many targeting astrology's overreach. Yet the demand persisted. When earthly causes seemed inscrutable, people turned to the cosmos. Among the villages, astromedicine formed a communal rhythm. Seasonal festivals coincided with equinoxes and solstices, blending church holy days with astrological rites. At Lammas, wheat sheaves were blessed when the moon was full. At Michaelmas, meats were salted when Mars was waning. Such customs tied daily life to celestial cycles, embedding astromedicine into folklore, songs, and harvest feasts. But as the Renaissance dawned, printed star charts and mechanical clocks began to replace chalk-scrawled tables and haphazard rituals. Astronomers like Copernicus challenged Ptolemaic geocentrism. Within a century, astromedicine would be questioned, marginalized, and gradually supplanted by anatomy, chemistry, and modern pharmacology. Yet, for a time, the healing arts reached for the heavens, hoping that by understanding the music of the spheres, they could restore harmony within the body. And as you tuck your own child under blankets engraved with zodiac signs, you might smile at how closely medieval healers held the cosmos to their hearts. The stars, shimmering above thatched roofs, guided more than crops and commerce. They guided life and death itself. And in that cosmic dance, humanity found both solace and mischief, believing they could read the sky's hidden script and write their own destinies in its margins. The morning light in the Vatican City spills through narrow windows, dust motes dancing in golden shafts as you step into the Sistine Chapel. The air is hushed, visitors speak in whispers, afraid to disturb the centuries-old frescoes overhead. You crane your neck, eyes tracing the intricate scenes painted by Michelangelo nearly 500 years ago. Most see Adam's outstretched finger reaching toward God, a moment frozen in time. But if you look closer, you realize you're not just gazing at a biblical tableau, you're staring at a silent rebellion. Michelangelo Buonarroti wasn't a man to follow orders blindly. He was at heart a sculptor, torn between carving marble and wielding a paintbrush. The church wanted glory, divine muscle flaring in vibrant hues. But Michelangelo had his own message, one he hid in plain sight, right in the center of the fresco we now call the creation of Adam. Take a deep breath and refocus on that famous panel. On the right, God, draped in swirling draperies, surrounded by angels, reaches out. On the left, Adam, nude and relaxed, returns the gesture. But the shape around God, the flowing, red-tinged cloak, resembles something else entirely. A cross-section of the human brain. Modern neuroanatomists first noticed it centuries later. But for Michelangelo, that clever design may have been pure craftsmanship or a wink. Think about it. In an era when dissecting corpses was often deemed sacrilegious, here is the divine brain itself honored on a chapel ceiling. Maybe Michelangelo was telling us that human reason, our own spark of divinity, comes not just from the heavens, but from our minds. After all, the church preached that God's word is supreme. Yet here was the artist suggesting God and mankind were collaborators, partners in creation. Now, notice Adam's hand. It isn't stiff, like a wooden puppet's. It's languid, almost reluctant. His fingers hover, as if he's juggling the weight of possibility. He's not simply receiving life, he's choosing it. Michelangelo didn't depict a brain-dead figure. He painted a conscious being, poised on the brink of awareness. Maybe he was nudging viewers to think for themselves, to value the intellect God gave us. A hidden sermon in pigment. Of course, such a hidden motif was risky. The Pope Julius II, nicknamed the Warrior Pope, wasn't known for appreciating theological nuance. He wanted celestial might, not anatomical commentary. Yet Michelangelo finished the ceiling in 1512, and no one burned him at the stake. Perhaps the clergy were too awed, or the artist too revered, or maybe the subtlety was too well camouflaged. Those folds could be robes, after all scholars debate. But the fact that we still marvel at the possibility hints that Michelangelo's gamble worked. Beyond the brain, there are other sly details. Look at the arrangement of angels and drapery. Some say it mimics brain arteries, while others spot the shape of a human uterus in the depiction of the Virgin's hand over Mary, in the separation of light from darkness, symbols of life's physical and spiritual origins. Whether conscious or serendipitous, these shapes echo themes of birth, knowledge, and divine spark. Imagine how a learned viewer in 16th century Roma, condemned scholar hiding forbidden Greek texts, might have recognized these shapes and felt a thrill. Here, in the chapel central to Catholic power, lay visual cues honoring reason and humanity's role in the cosmic drama. It was a secret handshake across centuries, a silent reassurance that intellectual curiosity could coexist with faith. Michelangelo's bold stroke extended beyond symbols. His palette was subdued earthy reds, muted greens, soft golds eschewing the dazzling blues and purples favored by his contemporaries. This choice kept the viewer's attention on form and content, not showy color. Even his humor flicks through the frescoes. a playful cherub smirking at you, as though to say, "Did you catch that? Good." And then there's the humanism woven into countless faces. Prophets gazing thoughtfully, sibyls draped in classical attire, muscles tensed as if still sculpted in marble. These details breathe life into stone walls. They remind us that art, when wielded by a master, can be a sermon engraved in pigment, a challenge to those who look without seeing. As you stand beneath that painted brain, you might catch yourself glancing at your own reflection in a polished marble floor. Are you an unthinking audience, or are you an active participant in meaning-making? Did Michelangelo's secret whisper reach you? It's a question that lingers as you exit the chapel, torching your curiosity like a beacon. And in that lingering question lies the power of art and of knowledge itself. The hidden brain reminds us that from the darkest of ages, when books were chained and minds subdued, there arose a moment captured in fresco and shadow, where reason found its way back into divine conversation. A message too subtle for tyrants to silence, yet bold enough to echo through the centuries. Next time you feel overwhelmed by ancient dogmas or modern absurdities, remember that flicker of rebellion overhead, God's hand tenderly brushing against our own. It's a reminder that the human mind is no less sacred than the divine, and that understanding can be its own act of worship. The years of plague, fire, and fear finally began to carve cracks in the seemingly indestructible walls of medieval authority. Imagine standing in the same square where your wife was condemned, where villagers once cheered at the flames, but now find the pulpit empty and the manor gate ajar. The world you knew centered on lordly decree and papal edict is unraveling, thread by thread, under the pressure of a transformed populace. First came the labor shortage. Fields that once groaned under the weight of grain lay half-tended, overgrown with weeds. The reeve, once so assured in his tally of tithes, found peasants vanishing dead of plague or fleeing in search of fairer terms. Suddenly, those who remained had leverage. They knew they were scarce and indispensable. Metal workers hammered armor now useless. Gravediggers dug deep holes that still held secrets. Coopers crafted barrels that trade caravans required. Your own hands, calloused from decades of kneading dough and hauling water, were more valuable than the Lord's empty pockets. So you marched quietly, somberly into the manor hall, clutching your lease parchment and a simple petition. A fixed rent for your cottage and 2 acres, rather than an ever-rising tithe. The reeve sneered, but his eyes flickered when you mentioned he faced a half-empty granary. Within days, he returned with a trimmed-down demand. You paid your rent gladly, knowing you'd wrested freedom from oppression. Across the region, similar bargains were struck. Charters granted peasants rights to hold common land, marry without the Lord's consent, or sell surplus produce in open markets. Guilds of craftsmen formed too, demanding training standards, fair wages, and the right to control their own trade. These guilds didn't kneel before church bells or swear fealty. They met in town halls, debated bylaws, and elected officers. The concept of collective governance foreign to feudal tradition took root. Simultaneously, towns grew. Surrounded by walls once built to keep peasants in, they now beckon survivors with the promise of anonymity and opportunity. You could be a blacksmith in Lyon, brewing ale in Rouen, or teaching children in a newly founded grammar school in Oxford. National identities, once faint in local dialects, began to emerge as trade networks linked distant cities. A merchant's franc, a Florentine florin, a Venetian ducat, all acquired value beyond village tokens. Money became portable, written contracts enforceable by civic courts rather than feudal lords. And the church? Its authority crumbled on 2 fronts. The first blow came when priests failed to stem the plague. As bodies piled at church doors, many clergy deserted their parishes, leaving flocks to fend for themselves. Your own priest, who once preached daily, vanished for months, returning gaunt and silent. His whispers of forgiveness felt hollow when you watched your children convulse with fever and die unbaptized. The second blow was intellectual. While monasteries once monopolized learning, universities surged after the Black Death. Scholars in Paris argued over Aristotle's ethics. Law students in Bologna debated Roman codes. Venetians translated Arabic astronomy. Texts in Latin multiplied, but with vernacular translations emerging too. Grammar schools opened for sons and sometimes daughters of merchants and minor gentry. Literacy began to spread beyond cloister walls. You taught your own child to read a simple catechism in French, proud to see the letters form words like liberté and justice. These universities birthed a new class, the educated bourgeoisie. They served kings and princes as advisors, drafted treaties, and calculated taxes. They were not nobles by birth, but by skill, and they answered first to civic councils, not to bishops. In towns, the rich merchant could own land, but only pay agreed rents. If a bishop tried to seize his property, the town court might intervene. This shift planted the seeds of separation between civil and ecclesiastical power. Meanwhile, whispers of reform reached every hamlet. John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English, so common folk could read sacred texts without a priest's filter. Jan Hus preached in Bohemia that scripture, not papal bulls, held ultimate authority. These voices were branded heretical, yet they resonated with peasants who remembered the plague's betrayal. If God allowed such horror, perhaps divine will could be found in personal conviction rather than in ornate cathedrals. By 1415, Hus was burned at Constance, but his followers, the Hussites, rose in revolt, challenging both church and crown. They seized silver mines, repelled crusaders, and established communities governed by elected councils. Their legacy echoed in later reforms, the idea that a faithful community could govern itself under Scripture rather than under a distant pope. Even within the church, change arrived. The Council of Constance, and later the Council of Trent, confronted corruption, selling of indulgences, and the hollow ritualism that plagued the faithful. New monastic orders, the Jesuits among them, pledged poverty, education, and missionary zeal. They founded schools and colleges, not simply to enforce doctrine, but to engage with science, philosophy, and the wider world. In your own village, you witness a subtle transformation. The parish church, once a place of fear, becomes a meeting house for both worship and instruction. Your children learn basic numeracy to manage household accounts. Local healers share cures at public fairs. Town criers deliver royal edicts, tax notices, and even translations of papal letters openly posted on notice boards. Authority is no longer whispered behind closed doors. It's printed on paper and read aloud in market squares. And governance evolves. Where once a single lord ruled by divine right, now town councils manage water supplies, maintain roads, and levy fair tariffs. Representatives meet at annual fairs, forging alliances that transcend local fiefdoms. You send a delegate to the council, your neighbor, a former blacksmith turned clerk, who argues for permission to hold a weekly market. When bishops protest, the council points to the town charter. The bishop's complaint is politely redirected to civic authorities, who handle it swiftly. A new conversation frames daily life. What rights do individuals hold? How much must one pay for protection? Does a king rule by God's grace or by the consent of the governed? Is salvation granted by tithes or by personal faith? These questions, unthinkable a century ago, now echo in taverns as often as in cathedrals. This collapse of control didn't happen overnight. It was messy, chaotic, marked by peasant revolts like the Jacquerie in France and the English Peasants' Revolt. Those uprisings were brutally suppressed, yet they forced rulers to reform. They showed that peasants, armed with bloodied pitchforks and printed tracts, could demand change. By the dawn of the 16th century, feudalism's skeleton remained, but its flesh was transforming. Lords still owned castles, but their tenants held deeds. The church still preached salvation, but pamphlets taught personal faith. Education still required Latin, but grammar schools taught the vernacular first. Knowledge spread, commerce boomed, and the idea of a static, unquestioned order dissipated like smoke. As you walk through the village you left behind, now a bustling market town surrounded by stone walls, you marvel at how far you've come. The Lord's banner still flies over the manor, but his power is checked by charters, councils, and contracts. The priest still rings the bell for Mass, but he also presides over parish schools and hospitals institutions governed by town statutes as much as by sacred vows. The iron grip of your ancestors has loosened, replaced by a web of civic rights, economic incentives, and religious variety. Control has collapsed not into chaos, but into a new balance. Individuals, communities, and institutions negotiating power every day. Tomorrow, you'll open your shop at dawn, greet merchants from distant lands, settle arguments in the town hall, and volunteer at the newly established grammar school. You'll read letters from a cousin in Florence about a painter named Leonardo who draws flying machines. And you'll tuck your child into bed, whispering about universities in Paris where philosophers debate free will. That's the world you've inherited, a world born from catastrophe but built on new foundations of learning, law, and local empowerment. The Dark Ages may have cast the longest shadow, but it was overthrown by the light of countless small rebellions, petitions, translations, guild meetings, and the simple act of writing one's name. The candle burns low now. Imagine the medieval night once more still, hushed, and crackling with secrets. Our journey nears its end, but let's pause at the threshold between shadow and dawn. If the early Middle Ages felt like stumbling through fog amid superstition, hunger, and rigid power, then the later centuries flicker with promise. The final chapter of this era isn't a scream or a sermon. It's a murmur persistent, defiant, and human. For all its fear and darkness, the Middle Ages were not stagnant. In fact, what we call the Dark Ages might better be remembered as an age of fermentation, a period where ideas bubbled, slowly at first, beneath the crust of orthodoxy and tradition, and eventually popped loud enough to be heard across centuries. Take, for example, the rise of individual conscience. 1,000 years earlier, Roman law defined identity by status slave, free, citizen, outsider. By the 1400s, a growing sense of interior life of the soul as a battleground between faith and doubt began to emerge. Confession evolved from a communal rite to a personal, internal reckoning. People began to write memoirs, visions, and mystical experiences. Women like Marjorie Kemp dictated their spiritual autobiographies. Knights penned chivalric dreams. Merchants tallied moral debts alongside financial ones. Identity was no longer only who you were born, as it was who you were becoming. At the same time, the landscape itself changed. Dense forests that once cloaked Europe thinned to make way for farmland, towns, and trade routes. The roads improved. Horseshoes and stirrups allowed faster travel. Inns sprouted along major paths. Itinerant preachers, troubadours, and tinkerers became vectors of news and novelty. Ideas, once locked in scriptoria, now wandered on foot and horseback. They were shared over ale and around hearths. Your grandmother might learn of distant wars, or strange machines from the east, or rumors that men had reached unknown islands beyond the sea. And with these whispers came visions of a different world. We cannot forget the resilience of women, even within these constraining times. While legal rights remained limited, peasant women often managed farms while husbands traveled or fought. Widows, especially, enjoyed legal autonomy. Some became landowners, brewmasters, even financiers. In towns, artisan wives took over their husbands' workshops and guild positions. Nuns led abbeys that housed libraries and schools. Female mystics became celebrities. Hildegard of Bingen composed music, diagnosed illness, and debated theology with bishops. these were not just exceptions. They were quiet revolutions in embroidery, commerce, and prayer. Education spread like wildfire across these late centuries. Picture a candle being passed from hand to hand, from monks to nobles to merchants to children. A scribe teaches an apprentice. A mother shows her daughter how to keep accounts in a linen ledger. A wandering scholar leaves behind a riddle in Latin scrawled on a tavern wall. As literacy grows, memory begins to shift, not just oral tradition passed down at the hearth, but ink on vellum, parchment, and finally paper. The Great Leap? When Gutenberg's press clattered into life around 1440, it was like someone had thrown open the monastery gates and yelled, "Now, everyone can read." Books poured out, almanacs, Bibles, herbal manuals, poetry. Not just for the wealthy, not just in Latin. Within decades, peasants read proverbs, students debated morality plays, and nobles puzzled over geometry in their private libraries. What had once been hidden history, science, even satire, became common ground. And then came art. Not just sacred frescoes in candlelit chapels, but vibrant tapestries, woodcuts, paintings on household panels. Artists like Giotto, then Van Eyck, began rendering humanity with startling realism. Faces held emotion. Bodies bore weight. The divine was no longer only a golden icon. It was Mary cradling Christ with weary eyes, or a carpenter sweating in the midday sun. Art met daily life in stained glass and sculpture, turning cathedrals into storytelling engines. The walls preached where priests failed. A stonemason, barely literate, could carve scenes of heaven and hell, saints and sinners, and imbue stone with a sense of human drama. By the 1400s, something remarkable had taken hold. A hunger for truth not delivered by decree, but discovered through inquiry, observation, and expression. Astronomy shed its purely symbolic role and became scientific. Physicians started to dissect bodies, questioning ancient texts. Navigators began sketching coastlines with increasing accuracy. Every map, every chart, every numbered star became a tiny rebellion against ignorance. Even the notion of time itself shifted. Monasteries had always kept time by bells, but now towns installed mechanical clocks. Citizens organized their days around hours, not sunrises. Work became scheduled, lives divided into measurable segments. The abstract became physical. You could hear time tick. And amid all this change, the people, yes, ordinary people like you, found new ways to dream. You dreamed not just of surviving winter, or escaping famine, or warding off demons, but of sailing west, studying abroad, owning a shop, writing a book. 1,000 small dreams forged a future that no longer bowed before inherited power. Because make no mistake, the Dark Ages weren't entirely dark. They were candlelit, uncertain, and chaotic, but they birthed the foundations of modern life. Parliaments, public schools, personal rights, scientific inquiry, and secular art, they all crept in during these flickering centuries. And what's more, they remind us that light doesn't arrive in a thunderclap. It trickles in through stone cracks, between the slats of barn doors, reflected on frozen ponds in moonlight. The end of the medieval world wasn't sudden. It was like the first pink glow before sunrise. A dawn stretched over generations. As we close this long, gentle voyage through superstition, sorrow, and resilience, let's leave behind the simplistic myths of savagery and gloom. Let's remember that even in the dimmest centuries, people sought meaning, love, knowledge, and something beyond mere survival. In their scribbles and songs, their bread recipes and ballads, their healing herbs and whispered prayers, they passed us the tools to build brighter futures. And so, dear listener, as we leave behind the haunted fields and flickering torchlight of the Dark Ages, let's take one long, quiet breath together. The night is still, the chaos silenced, and only the rustle of history lingers like a whisper through the trees. The tales we've followed tonight, may be stained with fear and folly, cruelty and confusion. But within those shadows, there were always flickers of firelight, of resistance, of reason, of those few brave souls who dared to ask questions when the world demanded silence. It's strange, isn't it? How the deepest darkness often teaches us the brightest lessons. That we must protect knowledge, encourage doubt, and nurture the freedom to learn, to speak, to be. These lessons weren't carved gently. They were bled into the soil across centuries. But you're here now, with electricity instead of pitchforks, with libraries instead of dungeons, and with the ability to see the past not as a prison, but as a mirror. So as you sink softly into your pillow tonight, remember, even the longest age of ignorance ends eventually. Even the coldest night can't keep the morning away forever. You are part of that sunrise now. Rest easy, curious soul. You've walked through 1,000 years of shadow, and still you shine. Good night.